Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so great to be with you all today. My name is Lisa Klein, and I am a vice president here at Keys to Literacy. And I'm excited for us to have a little bit of time to talk about something that is super important, which is sentences and helping our students to become stronger writers. So I'm going to jump right in. And as I mentioned, we'll have some time at the end to take some questions and hopefully provide some answers, okay? So I'm going to get started here. Okay, so before we jump into sentences, I just want to start big picture and help to make some connections between reading and writing. We know there's been, importantly, a big focus on reading, and we want to make the connection between what we're doing in reading and writing and how we can strengthen our students in all aspects of literacy. So we start with this quote, which is reading and writing float on a sea of talk. And we know that oral language is critical in developing our students' literacy skills. And so we want to think about this spectrum from kindergarten all the way through fifth grade, how we can build opportunities for oral language and how providing students with oral rehearsal prior to their writing really advantages them as they move through the writing process, okay? So I want to start with this visual, and Joan is actually has done a session for the writing rope here for Patan, so you may have been part of that. But we want to look at this visual of the writing rope created by Joan Sedita, who is also the founder of Keys to Literacy. And in this construct, the idea is that writing has many, many different components. And so by using the visual of the writing rope, we want to draw to everyone's attention, what are the components that you want to be thinking about as you are providing writing instruction, as you are evaluating different curriculum and materials? How can you think about each of these components and how they are addressed across kindergarten through fifth grade? So this is a resource that you can get for free at keystoliteracy.com in the free resource section. You can download this, but essentially the strands are transcription, and that refers to things like spelling and handwriting, writer's craft, things about task, audience, and purpose, text structure, how a piece of writing is built. We're going to focus on this red strand, syntax today, all about sentences. And then the purple strand is around critical thinking and generating ideas. We also think about writing process when we think about that critical thinking strand, okay? Now, what we know is that reading and writing share the same cognitive processes. And so Fitzgerald and Shanahan talk about having this commonwealth from which reading and writing really draw from. Okay, and so when we're thinking about making these connections, what I want you to be thinking about is how does reading support writing? And then conversely, how does writing support reading? And so what we want our students to do is to read like writers. And when they read like a writer, they're really paying attention to how are these sentence crafted? What moves did those writers make, right? And then when writing supporting reading is, we know that writing is a tool that can help us better know and understand the content that we're learning. So we want to think about those processes. And I know that many of you are familiar with Scarborough's reading rope here, but we're going to think about the connections between the reading rope and the writing rope as we look specifically at how are these connections made in reading and writing. Okay, and we really focus on using the language structures to both convey and gain meaning. Okay, now there are a couple of important research reports that we draw from in this work. One that I want to highlight for you is this IES report of teaching elementary school students to be effective writers. This is open access resource, so everybody can access it. And essentially, there were 4 key findings here. Having kids have daily time to write, that's really important. Now, what they recommend is 60 minutes a day. What I want you to think about is, rather than 60 minutes of sitting still at a desk and writing, are there opportunities for them to generate sentences in math, in science, in social studies, so they have multiple opportunities to really interact with the content and to practice the writing, okay? Think about writing process and fluency. And I want you to look at that number 3, that third recommendation. Notice here, we talked about this a little bit in that transcription strand of the writing rope. When we're thinking about the fluency that students need, or the automaticity, they need that with handwriting and spelling, typing, word processing, but also in sentence construction. And so that's really where we're going to focus our work today, okay? I just want to draw attention to this model, which is called the Not So Simple View of Writing by Berger and Wynn. And when we're thinking about this, we know writing is a complex activity. And sometimes we think, well, it's just a sentence. How hard can that be? But there are so many things that happen as students are going to even write one sentence. We know that working memory sits in the middle of this, and that working memory only has so much room, right? And so if students are focused on transcription, or how do they form a letter or spell a word, it really does not allow them to focus on that larger composition of thought or that text generation. And executive function plays a really important role here. We know that writing really requires students to attend to a task, to be able to focus, to be able to set goals about what it is that they are writing about. So all of this is to just confirm that writing is a complex process, and we need to think about how we're supporting our students as they move through that. We look at this gradual release of responsibility model to say, when it comes to sentence writing, we need to have direct, explicit instruction, right, from the teacher. We need opportunities for the oral rehearsal and practice in that guided time in the we, and then we release students to work independently. And what the research tells us is that students need direct, explicit instruction, as well as scaffolds to support them as they move through this process. And then really quickly, you have these slides. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I did want to make some connections for you to those knowledge and practice standards as we look at the essential principles of structured literacy, listening and reading comprehension, and then we go on into the written expression. So as we think about sentences and syntax, we really want to think about how critical they are. And I think in a lot of places, this is my experience. I've been a classroom teacher and reading specialist, but as a classroom teacher, I was in a rush to get my kids to paragraph. And in that rush, I really wasn't spending the time with my students on sentences that I probably should have. I mean, if we could all go back to our classrooms, 20 years later, I'm sure we all have those things we want to think about. But when we think about these language standards, now, you're thinking about the writing standards, those 10 writing standards, which are very important, but we also want to draw your attention to the language standards. Now, I know we have people from all across the United States and likely other places of the world as well, but when you look at those Common Core standards, we're really thinking about, okay, in these 6 language standards, that's where the sentence construction really is held, not so much in the larger 10 writing standards. So you want to take a look at those and look at the vertical articulation, kindergarten through 5th grade, and that will really help give you a sense of the expectation of where students are around sentences, okay? So let's just talk a little bit about how we develop students' sentence sense. When we are thinking about developing their sentence sense, we're talking about building their syntactic awareness, right? And as we're thinking about building this syntactic awareness, we really want to think about where students are, how we can get a better sense of that based on their oral language to help us figure out what they need around their sentence work, okay? And can they hear the difference between swims the turtle or the turtle swims? They might not be able to identify exactly what's not right grammatically, but if they can hear it, that tells you that they have this developing sense of syntactic awareness, okay? All right, so when we think about this crucial role of sentences, we want to think about sentences being this foundational building block, right? And one by one, how sentences really communicate meaning. We can think about this as it relates to both comprehension and written expression, okay? And so when I'm going to show you many different activities today, but what I want you to think about is how can you do some of this work embedded in text that you're already reading with students. So maybe you read something yesterday in your class together, and today there's some sentence work where you've pulled sentences directly from the text that you read yesterday, and you have students doing some work with that, okay? As you're thinking about your students as writers, and we looked at this when we were looking at the executive functions and thinking about the role of setting goals, we want our students to be able to set goals for their sentence work. Now, this is an example from a primary classroom, right? Where students are setting goals for the sentence work that they're doing. And we know the more concrete and specific and actionable our goals can be, then the more likely we are to be able to execute them properly. So here we can see they're setting goals around sounding out the words, using finger spaces, telling more, making the words easy to read, right? And that is something that as a class they have been working on and processing. And these students are identifying those areas where they're setting goals for their own writing, okay? All right, that is a little about the reading writing connection, a little bit about the writing rope, a little bit about the language standards and the research. I hope that was helpful to set our context. Let's just talk a little bit about sentence instruction now, okay? So when we're thinking about these sentence instruction goals, again, this is a workshop for K to 5, so there's quite a span there. But we want to think about, okay, how can we help to support comprehension by developing our students' syntactic awareness, right? And we know that if we can make a really strong reading, writing connection, doing things like reading like a writer, that is noticing the moves that other writers make when we're reading them, so that when we are the writers, we can think about what moves we want to use in constructing our own text, right? We also want to think about how can we teach some sentence basics. Our students need to know that there are 2 parts to every sentence, that there are 4 types of sentences. And the goal in that work is not so that they can identify what kind of sentence it is in isolation on a worksheet, but rather can they embed different types of sentences into the work that they are doing, okay? We also want to think about how can we help our students write sentences more fluently. Want to think about how we can start our sentences in different ways. So not every sentence starts with my cat is, right? We want to think about how we can use different kinds of sentences and have a variety of sentences in our work, okay? Through this attention to syntax, this is also going to help our students develop a better sense of grammar. And what we know is that the grammar in isolation, right, is not the goal. It's teach them these grammatical principles so that when they are writing, they will know and understand how to grammatically construct their sentences in a way that makes sense. And I want you to think about what we know is when we have grammar taught in isolation of the actual writing, that oftentimes students are not making the transference of that skill that they did in isolation into their actual writing. So we want to make sure that we are really leveraging these opportunities. And I'm going to show you some examples of how you can do this in your classroom, of really showing them, how do we use a comma when we're sentence combining, for example? What's the difference between and but? And how do they function differently in a sentence? So we really want to kind of build that context for grammar through the work students are doing authentically. Okay. All right. I love this top-down topic web. This is a graphic organizer we use at Keys to Literacy, and essentially the top-down topic web is really focusing here on sentences. And we're looking at, in the red, one area of focus is teaching sentence basics. So when we're thinking about teaching our students, we're thinking about, okay, there are two parts of sentences. We want them to know and understand that. There are 4 kinds of sentences that good writers use in a variety of ways in their actual writing. So that's one category of instruction. On the blue side, there you see developing syntactic awareness. And we're thinking about developing syntactic awareness. Here, we're thinking about activities like the sentence scramble, formerly called the sentence anagram. We also think about sentence elaboration and sentence combining. So one recommendation that I'll often make to people is that, especially if you are a classroom teacher and you have language centers that are going on in your classroom, to be able to have students move through these different activities around sentences that are all focused on the content that they are learning in science, in social studies, in ELA. That gives them multiple opportunities to interact with the vocabulary and the content of what they're learning while they are strengthening their sentence construction skills. Okay? Good. Now, I showed you the slide of gradual release of responsibility a little bit early on. When we're thinking about the instructional sequence as it relates to this sentence work in particular, at the I stage, we're really thinking about the teacher is modeling the sentence activity, doing some really strong think alouds for students. Then in the we stage, there's opportunity for practice. And this can be students with the teacher, students with one another, right? But there's some guidance that's involved. And then we release them to apply the practice to their own sentences, okay? In all of the activities that I'm going to share with you, I want you to be thinking about what is your objective. So what is it that you want students to know and be able to do as a result of each one of these activities, right? And then I also am going to offer some different scaffolds for you to think about, okay, who needs what and how might we help them be able to get to the goal with whatever scaffolding may be required, okay? All right, here we go. So let's talk a little bit about that first, the left-hand side of that web that I just showed you, and let's talk about the sentence basics, okay? So we know that this reading writing connection is really important. This is also connected to that blue strand that I showed you, which is text structure, okay? And text structure refers to how a piece of writing is built. And that matters because text structure impacts students' comprehension and their written expression, okay? So it's really important that we help students think about how is this piece of writing built so that when they go to be the writer, they can think about how they're going to build it. What pieces will they use? And we use those Duplo blocks to remind us that we're putting these pieces together, okay? All right, so I'm going to show you some examples today, and these all come from a book called One Tiny Turtle by Nicola Davies. And this is an excellent book. It has both a narrative text as well as informational text in it. And the reason why I want to show you these activities using that particular text is because, again, I don't want you to feel like you have to go to Teachers Pay Teachers for these kinds of tasks for students to be doing. You have so much content that you already have to go through. I want you to think about how you might be able to use that content, leverage that for the repeated exposure of vocabulary and content to build activities such as these, okay? So when we're thinking about the two sentence parts, we need students to understand what is a sentence, right? And a simple, complete sentence has two major parts. Now, we're going to call them naming and action. You might call noun and verb. What I would encourage you to do at your school is to have some dialogue around common language. Kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. What does that progression look like? What language are we using consistently so that students can really start to internalize these components, okay? So in this instance, our naming part is the turtle, and the action is swims, okay? Now, I want to show you some different activities that you can do. This first one comes from a Jamboard activity, but essentially we have two different buckets. So we have our naming bucket and we have our action bucket. And all of these words, again, are vocabulary words that came directly from the book that we've been reading and working on. And so in this activity, students are sorting naming parts and action parts, okay? We're also scaffolding this. How are we scaffolding? We are scaffolding by color coding as well. You will, again, think about your goals, where your students are. Do they need that support of the color coding, or are they able to do it independent of that? You'll know best where your students are. Okay, but I just want to offer you some different scaffolds as you're thinking about pulling this into your classroom. Okay, now, same idea. We're still focused on the two parts of a sentence. I'm going to show you a couple of different activities that you can consider. And I want to think about the increasing complexity of these activities as you're thinking about who's in front of you and how you might best meet their needs. So you could provide them with 3 cards. So one yellow card that says sea turtles and 2 other parts. One is about loggerheads or travel thousands of miles. Now, in this instance, they have to think about sea turtles and then they have to decide which matches, okay? Again, if they have that syntactic awareness, they can hear sea turtles is about loggerheads. They might not be able to identify what is wrong, but they can hear that something doesn't sound just right, okay? They might not be able to name it that we don't have matching subject and predicates, right? Now, as we think about increasing complexity here, we went from 3 cards, now we're down to 4 cards. So now we have sea turtles and this book, and now they need to match the 2 that go together, okay? And I want you to be thinking about the repeated exposure to the vocabulary and the concepts and how that's happening in this work that students are doing. So the other thing we can think about as we're thinking about the color coding are how else might we scaffold? Subjects can start with capital letters. We can have the ending punctuation represented as well as scaffolds for students, okay? Now, moving from the matching to now we're saying, okay, this is a little more complex. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna give you one part of the sentence and you are gonna generate that second part on your own. Okay, so you see now how this becomes both a comprehension as well as a writing activity because they need to lean into what did they learn about the mother turtles in the book One Tiny Turtle, right? So this is both an assessment of comprehension as well as written expression. Okay, now, in language standard number 1 in the Common Core standards, it says that by 4th grade, students will be able to identify sentence from fragment, and if it is a fragment, they would be able to correct that fragment, okay? So here is a sorting activity where we have fragment, not a sentence, and the word sentence, and then kids are putting into the appropriate category. I want you to notice how in these activities, they're not writing the whole sentence every single time. Students are not doing all the writing. We're still building their syntactic awareness. And for some of our students, particularly those who are still struggling with transcription skills, such as handwriting and spelling, these activities are really continuing to build that syntactic awareness without the focus on the transcription skills. Which is not to say transcription skills are not important. Of course they are, but we're always leading with our objective and we're thinking about how these activities might help to reach a specific objectives, okay? All right, so that was the 2 parts in sentence and fragment. Let's talk a little bit about the 4 types of sentence. Now, when we're thinking about this, when we look at those Common Core standards, they're saying by 1st grade, students should have an awareness of these different types of sentences and the ending punctuation that goes along with them. What we know, though, is that the goal is for students to authentically embed these 4 different types of sentences into the writing that they do, okay? So oftentimes what happens is we have so much that we have to cover in the classroom that we sometimes rush into having them do this as a worksheet in isolation of their writing, whereas we really want to think about encouraging them to use different types of sentences in the work that they do. So let's look at some activities of how you might be able to bring this into your own instruction, okay? So in the first activity, students are sorting their sentences. You see we have the pocket chart again in the first picture where we have the name of the different type of sentence and the ending exclamation point, right? And then different sentences that come again from One Tiny Turtle that are missing those those punctuation marks, okay? In this instance, students are working on their spelling words and they are using their spelling words in different types of sentences, okay? These make excellent center activities. In this next activity, what you're having students do is to, again, think about reading a sentence that doesn't have any ending punctuation and determining what type of sentence is it, and then what is the ending punctuation that goes along with that particular type of sentence. As a way to have students check their work, they can go back into the text, they can find those sentences, and they can identify if the way that they have categorized the sentence is the same, using the same punctuation as what the writer used. Okay, and again, you've got repeated exposure to the vocabulary and the concepts as well. All right, another activity here is you can have students work on changing their sentences. So they will take a statement, turn that into a question. Take a question, turn it into the statement. Turn a question into a command or an exclamation, okay? In doing this, you're really also offering kids the opportunity to think about what is their goal as a writer. Why would you use a question versus an exclamation? What are you trying to convey to your audience when you are the writer? So we really want to make these activities more meaningful, but by making sure we're connecting them back to, as a writer, you have many decisions to make about how you're going to construct your writing, how you're going to build your writing. So you want to think about what types of sentences you might use as you're trying to bring that meaning to your audience. Okay. All right, and there's our examples. Okay. Now, we also want to think about when can kids have the opportunity to create and write their own sentences. And here, they were studying maps, and so they had to think about how they could generate one of each type of sentences. So here's Mackenzie. Mackenzie wrote, "There's Mackenzie over in Canada. I live in the USA. Do you live in the USA? Find Mexico on the map." Okay, so she is working hard on using lots of different sentences. Okay, now in this last example, this is an example of now students are going back into the text and they are going to try to, on their own, identify different types of sentences and categorize them. And in this instance, the teacher has asked them to include the page number where they found that particular sentence or question, okay? And so here you can see they've done that, and they are including page number and the punctuation that goes along with the sentence. Okay, now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with sentence frames and using sentence frames effectively in your with your students. We want to think about, when we're thinking about these frames, right? There's sentences that are missing words. We can scaffold for students so that they're encountering more complex sentences, complete sentences, compound, complex sentences, right? And one thing we can offer to them is a word bank. And what we want to think about is, how can we help our students be able to get to these longer, more complex sentences? And if the word bank helps with those that might have word retrieval issues, or the vocabulary is still new and it's harder for them to kind of pull that out, the word bank is a nice way to have them really be able to read the sentence, like loggerhead turtles blank and blank. Say loggerhead turtles swim and have. You can tell I'm missing something, right? And so you would model going through this process and listening for, does this sound right? Okay. And there are lots of examples of how you can build the frame. We could think about those prepositional phrases, sometimes called where phrases or when phrases. We can think about those compound sentences with and or but, because, about those adverbial clauses. So there's lots of ways that we can build out sentence frames. What you always want to be thinking about are, what are your goals with your students instructionally? What are you looking for them to know or be able to do as a result of this? Then you can think about what is the best way to utilize sentence frames to meet those goals. Okay, I'm going to pause here now, and Stacy, I didn't know if there were any questions that came up in the chat that you might want me to address before we go into the syntactic awareness side of things.
We do not have any questions related to the content, just about some things, some logistical things with credit, and that information will be given at the end of the session.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to keep going then. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about, that was the thinking about the two parts of the sentence, and we're thinking about the sentence basics, and now we're going to move into this developing our syntactic awareness, okay? And as I mentioned, there are 3 activities that we really lean into as we're thinking about developing syntactic awareness. We have a sentence scramble, as I said, also called the sentence anagram. We have sentence elaboration and sentence combining. Okay. So as we're thinking about this syntactic awareness, We can use oral language to ask students if something sounds right. And we say, swims the turtle, or the turtle swims. And their responses may indicate if they have this syntactic awareness enough to be able to write grammatically correct sentences, okay? So as we're thinking about these different activities, our goal here is to give kids many, many opportunities to practice manipulating the different parts of sentences, okay? It's helpful for all students. Think about this as being especially helpful for our English language learners, okay? So let's start with the sentence scramble. So when we think about the sentence scramble, essentially what we're doing is we're having kids manipulate the different words to make complete sentences, okay? When you're thinking about how you might use this in your classroom, think about using sentences, as I've mentioned, from mentor text, from pieces that you're already reading across science and social studies and ELA, okay? We can think about using a sentence scramble as you do your morning message. Maybe your morning message is scrambled and they work to unscramble that, okay? We can think about using words that come from our phonics and spelling lessons. And for those of you who use foundations, the sentence scramble is part of the routines and foundations that you see. We're going to provide students with a set of steps to help them remember the process. And then we'll also think about how we can start by providing them the sentences, and then we're going to really be aware of that gradual release of responsibility and thinking about how we can gradually let students build their own sentence scramble activities, okay? So let's start by looking at a couple of examples, okay? So here we're saying unscramble these words to make a sentence. Now, what I want you to notice, we'll look at this first line: night, wait, the, until, hatchlings. I want you to notice that there is no scaffolding provided in these examples, okay? So you'll think about who's in front of you and how you best meet their needs. But if I were doing a think aloud with my students here, and I would love for you to do this in a pocket chart, or if on your smartboard you're able to actually physically move the pieces, maybe on Post-it notes, that is very helpful for students. So again, they're not having to write all the words every time they scramble and unscramble. We're really thinking about manipulating those parts to build that syntactic awareness so that they're hearing and then building the sentence so that it is correct. Okay. So night, wait, the, until, hatchlings. So I'm going to say, who or what is this about? It's probably about the hatchlings. Okay, what about the hatchlings? The hatchlings night, the hatchlings wait, the hatchlings until. The hatchlings wait. Yes, the hatchlings wait. When? Until night. And now, as we move this around, now I can turn this into a capital and I can have my period at the end of the sentence. Again, we're going to think about this from kindergarten through 5th grade. And as we think about that progression, we can think about the complexity of the sentence that students are unscrambling. So here, what I want you to notice is we have a turtle flaps her long front flippers. Students may say a turtle flaps her front long flippers. We could then have some really great dialogue on how we typically will keep front and flippers together because it's identifying a specific flipper, right? Flippers, and then long can go in front of front. Okay. So it allows us to have more complex discussions as students are becoming more sophisticated in their syntactic awareness. We can use the cards, as I mentioned to you, a super helpful way to have students do this, or Post-it notes on their desks, okay? At keystoliteracy.com, we have this free downloadable that you can get, which has this set of steps for sentence scramble. Anybody can access this, But essentially, the set of steps, remember, when we use the set of steps as a scaffold, it's sort of a task analysis. So these are the steps that you would need to go through, okay? And then what we do is we also provide then the template that holds the space for kids to do the thinking. So down here, you would write those words that are going to be scrambled, right? Kids would cut them out, and then they would practice putting them in the order that they think is correct.
I'll probably see you before I leave. I don't leave until about 4.
Oops. And then we would have them write out the sentence after it has been read to a friend. They draw the picture. This template is really helpful. Remember though, a template is a scaffold, and a scaffold is a temporary support. So as students gain their proficiency, and here we have a little one who's doing the turtle swims. Nice picture of the turtle there, right? As they gain their proficiency, we can see them really being creative in terms of how they are doing their sentence scrambles. So they had read The Very Hungry Caterpillar as a class, and the words they had were, "You can take just one." Now, notice the scaffold here. We have the asterisk, and then here we have that closing punctuation mark. What this student did was they added, "You can take just one lollipop." This student has, "You can take just one," and this student has, "You can just take one." So in all 3 instances, all 3 are correct. And this is particularly helpful for those students who may struggle with, but is this the right answer? Is this the right answer? In this activity, there's actually more than one way for them to do that, okay? And then we just have some examples to share with you, management-wise. How does this actually look in teachers' classrooms? And so they have the cards that all have the same character on it, right? We have our capital again, and our punctuation at the end. We also have boxes that can hold these. As you're thinking about your sentence scramble, really be aware of what are your goals, who's in front of you, what kind of scaffolds do they need. Don't start with the most complex sentence, right? Think about using simple sentences and then moving as kids gain their proficiency into those more complex sentences. And then we looked at lots of different examples of scaffolding. So we can capitalization, punctuation. We can think about the first word of the sentence is green, the last word is red, for example. If you're having them sort 2 different sentences, you can use fonts for different sentences, okay? This is too tricky. This was one of the sentences from the book, and it was too hard to do this way, okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about sentence elaboration, okay? When we're thinking about sentence elaboration, here what we're thinking about is how can we have students write stronger sentences, right? And we want to start with thinking about a simple sentence and ways that we can grow that so that we are providing our reader with more information or information to help them better understand what it is that we're trying to convey in our writing, okay? So as we're thinking about, all right, well, how will we use sentence elaboration? We'll talk to students about how elaborating sentences, again, helps their reader better understand what it is that they are trying to convey in their writing. We're also trying to, as the writer, answer questions that our readers may have about what it is we're writing about. I'm going to show you how to use these W question cards as a scaffold to help. And then we'll think about how can you provide some different word lists for students to help expand word choice. And again, make their word choice be really specific to what it is that they're writing about so that their reader can better understand. Okay, and we'll talk about expanding the kernel sentence, okay? Now, as we're thinking about this work of sentence elaboration, we think about this as it sits in the larger writing process kind of scheme. So as we're thinking about sentence elaboration, I want you to consider the opportunities for using sentence elaboration during revision, which sometimes can be a really hard stage for students with not knowing exactly how to make the writing stronger, okay? So let's look at how we can go from something simple like the dog ran to try to pump it up. We'll use some W cards to help us. What, when, where, how, right? We're going to think about this. And if this is our simple sentence, the dog ran, then the stronger sentence would be, when? This morning, I saw my neighbor's new puppy quickly run past my house. We have a completely different vision in our minds when we hear that stronger sentence. And that's what we want to convey to our students, but we also want to be really direct and explicit with them in how asking ourselves those extra questions help get more information to our reader, okay? So these cards that I mentioned, you can also download these for free at keystoliteracy.com in our free resource section. But essentially, we use these question cards to help expand the writing. And so oftentimes what happens is we might say things like, oh, you need to add more. And students say, well, like what? They're really not sure what to add. So if we can ask them specific questions, for example, the turtle swam. When did the turtle swim? Was it at night? Was it at dawn or dusk, midnight, right? So we want to help scaffold their thinking by providing these question terms. And we want to teach students how to use them with one another, right? Oftentimes when we think about if we're using this as a tool during revision, what students often do during revision time is they look for spelling mistakes, they look for punctuation errors, right? But what we really want them to focus on is the content. We revise for content and we edit for conventions. So how can revising our sentences make them stronger for, again, our message to be best understood by our readers, okay? Okay, now, another great scaffold that you can consider is using a picture. So this picture that I'm showing comes from a page of One Tiny Turtle. And when we think about this, how do you use a picture to help a student elaborate on a sentence? What the picture does is it helps bring out some of that language. It helps students draw language, okay? So if our sentence is the turtle swims, we look at this picture and now we can see the turtle is swimming into what? Looks like the turtle is swimming towards the seaweed, into the seaweed, deeper into the ocean, right? Lots of different words, adjectives, adverbs, gracefully swimming, right? So we can think about how we use the pictures to help activate the language to get students to elaborate their sentences. Okay. And we can also think about how if we're using this picture and we happen to know that One Tiny Turtle is really focused on loggerhead turtles, we can say the young loggerhead turtle swims into the seaweed, for example, right? And if we do this, have this oral rehearsal, it is reinforcing the vocabulary that goes along with whatever it is that we are learning about with our students. Okay. All right, I want to offer you another scaffold here, okay? And remember, a scaffold is a temporary support we put into place to help our students meet their goals, then we can gradually release those scaffolds. This scaffold is meant to help students during the process of sentence elaboration. And I just want to take a minute to think about what is the benefit of using something like this with our students, particularly those who struggle. Again, if they get a paperback and it says add more, and they feel like, well, I already added all that I know, then it's really hard for them to take that next step. So you could use this scaffold where we have our simple subject and predicate at the top, right? And then we have our question space for our question terms here. We're going to write notes, not complete sentences, in these little boxes. And then down here, we will write the final completed sentence. So let's take a look at one of these together. So here we have the turtle swims. We say, okay, what turtle was that? And how did it swim? We say, well, the green turtle swims fast. And notice we're paying attention to our capitalization and our punctuation, because when we were learning those different types of sentences, it was not to learn them in isolation, but to be able to think about, okay, what kind of sentence is this, right? And have students be able to make those connections, okay? And here we go. The turtle swims, and what I love about what Sophie did here was she didn't feel like she had to do any crossing out. She could just make a little X right over that period and say, actually, I want to tell you, and you can see it, the turtle swims fast, okay? And when we look at that writing standard 5 in the Common Core standards, that standard's all about writing process. And when you look at that vertical articulation, K5, of writing standard number 5, essentially when it talks about revision, kindergarten, first grade, it's really about adding more detail, right? It's not about a lot of other complex pieces. It is about adding more to the writing, okay? We can now think about our students in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. How are they adding now more complex when phrases and where phrases? So now we have that same sentence, the turtle swims, and we're thinking about, well, when is the turtle swimming? The turtle swims late at night. Where's the turtle swimming? In the ocean. Now, remember the point of this sentence work allows for there to be more than one right answer, which is really important when it comes to writing, because we want all of our students to have that success and feel successful as writers. Let's look at 3 different ways we could pull this information together. We might say the turtle swims late at night in the ocean. We might say in the ocean, the turtle swims late at night. Or we might say late at night, the turtle swims in the ocean. Okay. Are you seeing how this affords opportunity for there to be multiple correct responses from students, and how that will help? I don't know if you noticed or not, but one of those IES, the 4th recommendation, was to build a community of writers. And the way we build a community of writers is we allow there to be space for there to be multiple ways for students to get their writing to be as effective as possible. And we think about opportunities for them to have autonomy and choice in how they put their writing together when we provide direct, explicit instruction and use scaffolds such as this, okay? And then we can go even more complex. So we have our when and our where, and we add our why, okay? And now we have a couple of examples of sentence expansion. So the start sentence here is the eggs hatched. Now we're saying, well, what kind of eggs? Frog. Where? In the pond. When? When it was spring. Now I want you to notice that these students here are not writing in complete sentences. For many students, if they spend their time and energy writing out the complete sentence every time, by the time they get down here to this create sentence portion, they're going to be too frustrated. So we really want to think about, when are we asking them to write the whole complete sentence? We'll save that for when they have all of the ideas ready to be put together, okay? All right. We can also do this, for example, in social studies with read alouds that you might be doing, and being able to use those W questions to help generate more elaboration, okay? Same thing with our paper bag princess. If our sentence is the dragon arrived, who arrived? The dragon. What did he do? He arrived where? At the princess's house, at the cave. When? After her dress had been burned. How did he get there? He flew around many, many times while she made him tired, right? So as you're thinking about using this, again, in science and social studies and ELA across your day, we want to think about how are you helping students understand the little words, okay? And when we're thinking about these connecting words, we want to make sure that students know and understand how these words function in different sentences. So you can use mentor text, right? You model in your class discussions how you're using them so that students have multiple opportunities to interact with and, but, yet, so. They can hear them, they notice them when they're reading like a writer, right? And then they can gradually use those words effectively in the writing that they are doing. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the kernel sentence. So when you think about kernel, think about a little popcorn kernel. And I was lucky enough to, when I started my career, work at the Landmark School with Terry Jennings, and she did this with Charlie Haynes together. And the kernel sentence basically is saying that the kernel, the little popcorn kernel, is the noun and the verb. And how do we expand that kernel sentence? So now we're going to bring in words like adjective, adverb, right? We're going to talk about our where phrases and when phrases. We'll talk about how can you compound a subject or compound a predicate. How do you combine simple sentences to make a more syntactically sophisticated kind of a sentence, right? So as we're thinking about this, I'm just going to take this as a for example. When you think about elaborating the subject, you want to add adjectives. Now, oftentimes if we say to students, oh, you need to add an adjective, and they go, oh, what's an adjective? You say, oh, it's a word that describes a noun. It's still not concrete enough for them. So in this model of expanding the kernel sentence, you teach kids adjectives, color, size, shape, number. Those are the easy four, right? And so in really taking that big concept of adjective and further categorizing it, it helps students have a more concrete understanding of how they can grow sentences. So if we look at that sentence again, the turtle swims, and we say, okay, we're going to elaborate the subject. We're going to use an adjective. We're going to think about color, size, shape, and number. We can say, we'll think about the size, small, and the color, green. Now, what else do you notice here? We're bringing in the comma, right? So this is the perfect opportunity to talk to students about when we bring commas into our work and why. Then we can, move on to elaborate our predicate with an adverb. And now we'll add a where phrase to this. And we're now coming up with this really strong sentence. The small green turtle swims quickly into the seaweed. Okay. We can get more complex with this, compounding the subject, compounding the predicate. We can also think about if we take two sentences and compound those together. The turtle and his brother swim and float as the fish dart by. Okay. Now, when you're thinking about sentence elaboration, if you lean into those W cards and you do some Google searching around the expanding the kernel sentence, I think you'll find that within those concrete, specific, actionable boundaries, your students will be able to really elaborate their sentences in meaningful ways with the idea that it's going to help the reader better convey whatever the message is that they're trying to send to them, okay? All right, our last syntactic awareness activity I want to talk about is sentence combining. So sentence combining has been around for a long time. It was originally developed in the 1960s. And what we know is in sentence combining, this is effective kindergarten through college level, okay? So there is consistent research. For those of you who are in the secondary space, there was a report done called Writing Next. There were 11 key research findings of how to best support students, what to do with them. Sentence combining made that list of 11. So there's a lot of research here. And what we know is that it will help kids really produce these more syntactically mature sentences. When we're first getting started, we're going to do this orally with our students, okay? So we can start with some basic examples. And just like when we were talking about the sentence scrambles and having those on cards or being able to manipulate them on a smart board, it's super helpful when you're doing sentence combining if you could do the same thing. Do it in a pocket chart or on index cards or Post-it notes, but have kids be able to manipulate the two sentences. So here we have birds can eat baby sea turtles, fish can eat baby sea turtles. So if I'm modeling this for my students, I want to think about which words are repeated. So we have birds can eat baby sea turtles, fish can eat baby sea turtles. I recognize that can eat baby sea turtles is repeated. So now what I can think about is, okay, how will I combine these? Well, I think I'm going to say birds and fish can eat baby sea turtles. And in this instance, I don't actually need to do anything to my verbs here, but I did add a new word. I added the word and. So for some students, as a scaffold, in parentheses over here or on another card, you might offer them the word and, okay? We have the baby turtle swims, the baby turtle dives. I do want you to think about this as a revision strategy because you might get a student who writes sentences that are like that. The baby turtle swims, the baby turtle dives. Okay, now we're asking ourselves, what's in common? The baby turtle, okay? So now we have swims, dives. We're going to combine those, and again, we're going to use the word and. There are 6 turtle eggs. The turtle eggs are white. Ooh, this is a little different, right? It's not the same structure. There are 6 turtle eggs. At the end are the turtle eggs. The turtle eggs are white. Now we have to think about, okay, how will we manipulate these parts? Here we're going to say there are 6 white turtle eggs. And again, great opportunity to talk about the use of the comma. We can increase the complexity here by having these 3 sentences. The turtles have shells. The shells are made of bony plates. The shells get bigger as turtles grow. Now, we're going to need to combine these, which is why if kids could manipulate these, it'd be really helpful. Turtles have shells made of bony plates that get bigger as turtles grow, okay? Now, as you're thinking about this, I want you to again think about kindergarten to 5th grade. What are your largest goals? Who's in front of you? We're going to start by combining just 2 very simple sentences, right? We can do this orally, or we can do it in writing. We want to really lean into whatever content you're learning in science, in social studies, in ELA, so that they're getting the repeated exposure to the vocabulary and those concepts, okay? Let students work collaboratively. There's so much benefit in all the oral rehearsal of them reading it, listening, remanipulating the parts, trying it again, thinking about, I'll bring in the word and, maybe I'll bring in the word or, listen to it, hear what sounds best, right? So there's lots of time for kids to work collaboratively and to be able to explain the decisions that they're making. Why would you use and, not or in this particular sentence? How did you know to do that, right? And then let kids practice labeling parts of speech as needed, but the part of speech in isolation is not the goal or the focus of the activity, okay? And when you think about sentence combining, really effective to be able to do this a couple of times a week. And again, when we think about that IES report, recommendation number one was that students will write for 60 minutes a day. Think about 10 minutes in science, 10 minutes in social studies, in addition to their 30-minute writing lesson with you, and thinking about when you're teaching spelling, how you're giving opportunities for kids to also write about those spelling words and use the different kinds of sentences and work on sentence combining that way. Okay. I'm just going to finish by giving you a couple of activities that you can consider here using the close activity. So here we have turtles swim in water, turtles dive in water. Now we're saying, okay, turtles swim blank, dive in water. And, so, but, however. So again, they're not spontaneously generating the content of what is being combined. You are offering them the content based on what you're learning about, and you're also providing that word bank so that they can then go through and decide how would these sentences best be combined. Okay, the other piece I want to share with you really quickly is the revising sentences. And essentially here, as a revising activity, what you have your students do is go back in and look at their own writing and decide, okay, if you have 5 sentences in your paragraph, how many words were in the first sentence? What was the end punctuation? And then in subsequent sentences, how did you start them? What were the first 2 words? And what is that ending punctuation? And this is a nice way to have students do a little bit of sentence work as they are in the revising stage. Okay. I hope this has helped you as you're thinking about some concrete activities that you can do in your classroom around helping kids with syntax and thinking about the benefits for both comprehension and written expression. We have
Thank you,
lots of free
Lisa.
resources. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We
I was
do
just
have
going to say, we have lots of free resources for you to access. There's lots of great blog posts for those of you who are starting conversations around writing in your classrooms and with your teams and administrators. The blog posts can be really helpful for that as well.